A pro racer told a single dad to kneel if he lost, and he said it in a closed garage, right in front of that man's deaf little boy. Not on a live stream, but in front of the crew, like father and son were beneath him. That dad works night security at the track just to keep his kid in school. He swore he'd never drive again after the crash that almost took everything. But that day at the track, he took the wheel. And what happened next flipped the power in that place upside down. On a late summer afternoon in North Carolina, Lane Speedway hummed like a living thing. The asphalt still held the heat of the day, and the air above the track shimmered with it. In a few hours, the grandstands would be packed for Velocity Night. Banners for Velocity Fuel would be lit up, and cameras would be rolling. For now, the place belonged to crews and staff, to the echo of impact wrenches and the low growl of engines on test laps. Jack Morgan walked the inner corridor along pit road, with a security jacket zipped halfway up and a radio clipped to his shoulder. He moved with the relaxed alertness of someone who had walked the same route 100 times. On his left side, close enough to brush his arm with every step, was his 7-year-old son, Timmy. The boy wore a small, laminated staff family badge on a lanyard and a pair of tiny hearing aids that flashed silver whenever they caught the light. He clutched a spiral sketchbook to his chest, thumb hooked over the edge like he was afraid it might fall. Jack tapped 2 fingers lightly against Timmy's shoulder to get his attention, then turned so his face was squarely in the boy's line of sight. He shaped the words slowly with his mouth and his hands. "Stay by the yellow line." Timmy watched his father's lips, then his hands, and nodded. He knew the code of this place. Yellow lines meant safe. Beyond them meant danger, noise, and people who did not always look where they were going. From the open side of the pit lane, the sound of an engine climbing through the revs rolled in like thunder. Timmy's eyes lit up. He loved that sound, even if he didn't hear it as everyone else did. He felt it. Through the soles of his shoes. Through the rail, his fingers often curled around. Through the air in his chest when the cars flew by. Jack guided him along until they reached the open mouth of Garage 7, where the number 7 car sat under bright lights. The paint on the hood was polished to a mirror shine. The name above the door read, "Chase Armstrong" in bold white letters. Inside, a cameraman was coiling cables, and a social media producer was tucking her phone into her back pocket. A few minutes earlier, Chase had been in full performance mode for a quick sponsor video. Now the camera was off, the smiles were gone, and the room had settled into the tired rhythm of a long day at the track. Jack stopped just outside the tape that marked the staff-only boundary and touched Timmy's shoulder again. "Here," he mouthed and signed. "Watch." Timmy nodded. He opened his sketchbook with small, careful hands. On the top page was a drawing of the number 7 car, all sharp lines and big wheels, with 2 little stick figures beside it. One had spiky hair. The other wore a rectangle on his chest labeled Dad. Chase Armstrong stepped out from behind the car, fire suit half unzipped, arms damp with sweat. Up close, without the helmet and the grin for the cameras, he looked younger than his highlight reels made him seem, and more worn out. He was talking to a mechanic, voice low and fast, running through something about gearing and corner exit. As he turned toward the front of the garage, Timmy hesitated, then took one small step forward, still behind the yellow line. He held the sketchbook up with both hands so the driver could see. For half a second, Chase's eyes flicked down. He saw the drawing, the name on the door, the crooked number 7 by the rear tire. Under different circumstances, he might have smiled, might have ruffled the kid's hair and called it cool. Today he was tired, wired, and angry about tenths of a second no one in the stands would ever notice. He snorted, more to the room than to the boy. "Cute," he said. "Does he even hear the engines out there?" The words weren't shouted, but in the bright, echoing space of the garage, they carried to every corner. One of the crew guys let out a short, nervous laugh, and then seemed to regret it immediately. Timmy blinked. He hadn't caught every sound, but he saw mouths move, saw the look that rode on Chase's face and the half-smile on the mechanic's. His hands tightened on the sketchbook. Jack stepped forward before the laugh had even died. He planted himself between Timmy and the cluster of fire suits and tool carts, not aggressive, just there, a line that hadn't been there a moment before. His voice stayed low and even. "Don't talk about my son like that." Chase stopped. The mechanic beside him shifted his weight. A strip of silence opened in the middle of the humming building. Chase turned fully, taking in the security jacket, the radio, and the plain black boots. Up close, he recognized the man vaguely. The guard who scanned wristbands, checked gates, and nodded people through. Background. "Relax, man," Chase said. It was a joke. Jack didn't move. Jokes aren't funny when they're about a kid's disability. His eyes never left Chase's. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, but there was no space to misunderstand him. The mechanic looked down at his shoes. Another crew member busied himself with a tire that didn't need attention. Chase's jaw tightened. It was one thing to crack a line in front of his guys. It was another thing to have a security guard call him out in his own garage. "What do you know about any of this?" he said. "You scan wristbands and wave people through metal detectors. This is racing." Jack let out a slow breath. He could feel Timmy behind him, close enough that he could have reached back and touched his arm without looking. He didn't. He kept his hands at his sides. "This is still a place where people are supposed to respect each other," he said. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Timmy's eye. "Come on, buddy." He was ready to walk away, to take the hit and let the moment drop on the concrete floor. It wasn't worth a fight. It was never worth a fight when his son was standing within arm's reach. Chase's pride wouldn't let it end there. "Tell you what, hero," he called after them. Jack stopped but didn't turn around. The garage felt like it leaned in. "You ever want to talk to me like an equal?" Chase went on. "Get in a car." Now Jack turned back. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Chase, waiting. Chase shrugged, playing to the handful of eyes on him. "If you ever get in a car with me and lose," he said, "you kneel. Right here, in front of all of us. Let your hero learn what happens when he plays out of his league." No one laughed this time. The words hung there, heavier than he'd meant them to be, heavier than the cameras he thought were still around. There were no cameras now. Just the crew, the smell of fuel, the echo of his own voice. Jack held his stare for a long, quiet moment. Then he shook his head once. "My son doesn't need to see me kneel for anyone," he said. He reached back, found Timmy's shoulder with a familiar touch, and guided him away from the open mouth of the garage. Behind them, the hum of work started up again, but the sentence Chase had thrown out so casually stayed in the air like exhaust. Everyone in that room heard it. No one there was going to forget it. Jack's apartment sat on the second floor of a tired brick building not far from the highway, close enough that the windows rattled whenever a semi rolled past at night. From the outside, it looked like any other worn complex on the edge of town, but inside it was clean and carefully arranged in the way of someone who couldn't afford waste. The kitchen table was also a homework station, A narrow bookshelf held both old repair manuals and picture books about trucks and planes. In the corner by a small window, there was a desk that belonged entirely to Timmy, with a bent lamp, a jar of crayons, and 3 different notebooks filled with drawings of cars that always seemed to be in motion, even though they were frozen on the page. Morning started early. Jack moved around the kitchen on autopilot, frying eggs in a pan that had lost most of its nonstick, dropping bread into a toaster that liked to burn one side, pouring milk into a cup and stirring in just enough chocolate powder to make sure his son would finish it. The apartment was quiet, but for them, that wasn't strange. Silence was just the space where other things lived. When the eggs were almost done, Jack wiped his hands on a towel and walked down the short hallway to Timmy's room. The boy slept curled around a stuffed car with stitched-on headlights, hair a little too long, cheeks still round with childhood. His hearing aids rested in a small dish on the nightstand next to an alarm clock that blinked the wrong time. Jack sat on the edge of the bed and tapped 2 fingers lightly against Timmy's shoulder. The boy stirred, eyes opening slowly. Jack waited until Timmy was looking straight at him, and then formed the word with his mouth and his hand. Breakfast. He added the sign, thumb and fingers tapping near his lips. Timmy watched his father's lips, then the movement of his hand, and nodded. He reached for the hearing aids, settled them in place, and Jack watched for the tiny lights that told him they were working before he stood up. At the table, they sat across from each other. Jack pointed to each item as he said it, letting Timmy see the words on his lips as clearly as on his plate. Eggs, toast, milk. Timmy shaped the words back at him, sound barely more than a breath, but Jack smiled as he'd just heard a perfect speech. They ate without television or music. Their mornings were measured in glances, in small smiles, in the way Timmy's foot brushed Jack's leg under the table. On the refrigerator door, held by a magnet from some long-ago kids' event, was a folded letter with the school's logo. Jack had read it 3 times the night before. He didn't need to open it again to know what it said. Tuition increase, new therapy program, more support for kids with hearing loss, more cost. The numbers at the bottom sat heavily in his chest. He picked the paper up anyway, scanned the lines like something might have changed overnight, then slid it back under the magnet. Timmy's eyes followed the movement. He looked from the letter to his father's face, searching. Jack forced his expression to stay easy. He tapped the edge of the table to get his son's attention, then pointed to the backpack by the door and signed. School. Timmy slid off his chair and grabbed the pack, but instead of coming straight back, he veered to the little desk under the window. He flipped open a notebook and carefully tore along the perforated edge. It was a drawing of a racetrack, an oval with banked corners and tiny rectangles for cars. In the middle, written big and uneven, was one word: Dad. Timmy held the page out with both hands. Jack took it as it might break. Is this Lane? He asked, exaggerating the shape of the name. Timmy nodded and traced the word Dad with one finger. Then he made the sign for car and pointed at his father. You drive. The sign was simple. What it carried was not. For a second, the small kitchen dropped away. Jack saw wet asphalt under stadium lights, spray on the windshield, the wheel kicking in his hands. Years ago, he had been more than a night guard. He had been a test driver for Harborline Motorsports, the guy they trusted to push a car to its limits before anyone else climbed in. On a rain-soaked night, chasing a lap time no fan would ever see on a scoreboard, he had stayed out one lap too long. Another car followed behind, the support vehicle that his wife, Lily, was riding in. One bad slide turned speed into chaos. Metal hit metal, barriers blurred. Later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear, a doctor had sat across from him and talked slowly about impact, trauma, hearing loss, and we did everything we could. Lily didn't come home. Timmy did, but the world never sounded the same to him again. Everyone called it an accident. Jack never did. He called it his fault, and he walked away from racing before anyone else could decide what to do with him. He blinked the images back into the place he kept them. "Nobody," he said quietly. "I don't drive there anymore. I just keep people safe." He added the sign for safe, fists crossing and opening. Timmy looked at the drawing again, then at his father. He didn't argue. He folded the paper into a careful rectangle and slid it into the front pocket of his backpack, like he was putting the idea away for later. The drive to school was short. The old sedan rattled over every crack in the road. From the rearview mirror, Jack watched Timmy press his palm against the window as they passed a billboard with a race car on it, then leaned forward to catch his father's eye. Jack lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a small salute. At the drop-off line, he parked and got out, walking around to open the back door. He crouched so his face was level with Timmy's. "You good?" he asked, slow and clear. Timmy nodded. Jack signed, "Learn. Have fun. See you later." Timmy repeated the signs back and stepped out, joining the stream of kids heading toward the entrance, his hearing aids flashing in the morning light. Jack waited until his son disappeared through the doors. Only then did he let his shoulders fall. The people at Lane Speedway saw a quiet security guard who scanned wristbands and watched the gates. They didn't see the bills on his counter, the letters from the school, the nights he lay awake listening not for engines, but for the hitch in his son's breathing when a nightmare caught. He started the car and pulled away from the curb, steering toward the tall lights of the track rising in the distance. After Lily died, he had made himself a promise. No more speed, no more risks. Nothing that could let fate tear his world apart in a single bad second. Keep his head down. Put in the hours. Keep his boy safe. It was a small life, measured in paychecks, packed lunches, and bedtime stories told with his hands instead of his voice. For a long time, he thought that was all he would ever ask from the world. He had no idea the track was already winding up to ask more of him than that. By the time the sun was fully up the next morning, Lane Speedway looked less like a quiet oval of concrete and more like a small city waking up. Trucks from vendors and sponsors lined the service road. Crews rolled carts loaded with tires and tools along the pit lane. Speakers crackled as someone tested the sound system, a low burst of static followed by a few bars of music. Banners for Velocity Fuel hung from the grandstands and over every main entrance, their bright colors sharp against the gray of the track and the steel of the catch fences. By night, the place would be packed for Velocity Night. For now, it belonged to people in uniforms and credential badges, people who knew how much could go wrong before a single fan ever found their seat. Harper Lane walked the length of pit road with a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other. She wore a Lane Speedway polo, dark jeans, and a baseball cap with the track logo pulled low against the glare. She nodded to the safety crew, doing a final check of the fire extinguishers. She paused to watch a group of corner workers test their flags, colors flashing in the morning light. This track was the closest thing she had to a home, and today its future was tied to one event. Velocity Night wasn't just a catchy name. It was the centerpiece of a multi-year deal with Velocity Fuel, a sponsor big enough that her father had actually smiled when they'd signed the papers. The money kept the lights on, paid staff, and funded upgrades. In return, Velocity wanted a show, something that would make for good television and better commercials. The crown jewel of that show was a short segment slotted just before the main race, the Velocity Duel. 2-lane racing cars on track together, side by side under the lights, clean lines and controlled aggression, a moving billboard for how smooth and powerful the new fuel blend made their engines. 2 cars, 2 drivers. Harper checked the time on her watch and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. They had 1.5. Chase Armstrong, their star, was ready. The second seat was a problem. In one of the garages, behind a half-closed bay door, the number 12 car sat up on stands with a mechanic's legs sticking out from underneath. Its usual driver had pushed too hard in a test session 2 days ago, snapping the rear around on cold tires and backing it into the wall. The hit hadn't looked bad on camera, but it had been enough to leave him with a concussion and a stiff neck. The track doctor's orders had been clear. No high-speed running under lights, no matter how much anyone begged. Harper had seen those scans herself. She wasn't about to argue. She'd grown up hearing her father talk about drivers like they were replaceable parts in a very expensive machine. She'd also grown up seeing what happened when one of those parts failed at the wrong time. Letting an injured driver climb back in just to please a sponsor wasn't an option. Letting Chase run the duel alone wasn't either. Velocity's contract didn't say 1 car. It said 2. Harper stopped outside the lane racing hauler and keyed her radio. "Can we get a quick huddle?" she said. A few minutes later, she was in a makeshift conference area inside, a slab of folding table set up between stacks of tires and a whiteboard scribbled with tire pressures. Around her sat the team's head engineer, a legal rep for the track, and 2 senior crew members. Chase drifted in and leaned against the wall, half listening, helmet bag hanging from his hand. "We need a second driver for the duel," Harper said, skipping straight to the point. "He doesn't have to fight for a title. He does have to be safe, competent, and someone race control will sign off on." The engineer rubbed his forehead. "All our test guys are out of town or already booked. The only people with recent track time on this surface are Chase and the field for tonight." The legal rep flipped through a folder. "We can't just throw a celebrity or a sponsor rep in there," he said. "Insurance would lose its mind. For an exhibition run, we have a little flexibility, but not that much. They'd need some kind of documented experience. We're not putting a rookie in beside Chase at those speeds." One of the crew chiefs, a man in his 50s with grease on his knuckles and a name patch that read Rick, cleared his throat. "What about that guard?" he said. Harper looked at him. "What guard?" "The night guy," Rick said. "Morgan, Jack. I've seen him watching the lines when cars are out. Not like a fan, like somebody who knows what he's looking at." The engineer snorted. "Half the staff out there thinks they're a driver." "This one doesn't act like it," Rick said. "He keeps to himself. But I caught him the other night tracing turn 3 in the dust on the pit wall, talking through entry and exit points like he'd been there. Jack Morgan." He frowned, like the name landed somewhere he couldn't quite place. "I swear I've heard that name before." Harper filed it away. Jack Morgan, security. It matched the badge she'd seen at the end of a few emails about overnight shifts and gate changes. Before she could say anything, Chase straightened up from the wall. "You've got to be kidding," he said. "You're talking about the hero from yesterday?" Harper turned to him. "You heard about that?" Chase gave a short laugh that didn't hold any humor. Word about the scene in Garage 7 had moved through the paddock, the way gossip always did in places like this, changing shape a little with each retelling, but keeping the same sharp edges. "Everybody heard about it?" he said. Security guard gets brave in front of my crew. Cute story. He pushed off the wall and stepped closer to the table. Perfect. Let him take a lap. Let him see the difference between watching from behind a yellow line and actually doing something out there. The legal rep shook his head. We are not putting a random security guard behind the wheel of a sponsored car just because you want to prove a point. Chase shrugged. You're the one who said you needed someone. I'm just trying to help. His tone made it clear he meant the opposite. Rick looked at Harper, then back at his notes. The name still nagged at him. Jack Morgan. Somewhere in the back of his mind, it clicked against an old headline, a race report, a whispered story from another team. He couldn't drag it all the way into focus, not yet. Harper didn't make a decision at that moment. She just stood there in the cramped space with the sound of impact wrenches rattling the air outside, and felt the walls of the problem closing in. She needed a second driver. She needed to keep her track safe and her contract alive. Somewhere between those two facts, the name Jack Morgan hung in the air, waiting. The temporary office Harper had claimed for the week sat just off Pit Road, a narrow room with a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a window that looked out over the garages. It smelled like coffee, printer ink, and the faint tang of burned rubber that seemed to seep into everything on race days. Late that afternoon, she stood by the window, watching a golf cart pull up outside with a security guard riding shotgun and a small kid beside him. Jack climbed out first, still in his dark jacket with the radio on his shoulder. He reached back to help Timmy down, one hand steady on the boy's arm. Rick stepped out from another doorway and waved the kid over. Timmy hesitated, then went to sit with the older man on a low wall across from the office, sketchbook already coming out of his backpack. Harper opened the door. "Jack?" she said. He nodded once and stepped inside. The room felt even smaller with him in it, all quiet shoulders and tired eyes. He stayed near the door until she motioned to the chair across from the table. "You're not in trouble," she said, seeing the question on his face before he asked it. "If anything, you helped me yesterday." Jack sat, hands resting on his knees. "At the garage," she went on. "I heard there was an incident with Chase, and I heard you stood up for your son." Jack's jaw tightened, just a fraction. "I just asked him not to make a joke out of something that isn't a joke," he said. His voice was calm. It had the same steady weight it had in the garage. Harper nodded. "I'm not here to rehash that," she said. "I'm here because we have a problem, and you might be part of the solution." She saw the flicker of confusion cross his face. "We need a second driver for the Velocity Duel," she said. "Not a full-time seat. A short exhibition run beside Chase. Our usual guy is out with a concussion. Velocity Fuel wants 2 cars on track. Race Control wants someone who knows what they're doing." She let that sit for a beat. "Rick says you don't watch this place like a fan. He says you watch it like someone who's been on the other side of the fence." Jack's eyes dropped to the tabletop. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he exhaled slowly. "I used to drive," he said. "On tracks like this?" Harper asked. He looked up at her. No bravado, no fishing for a reaction. "For Harborline Motorsports," he said. "NCRA test program. I held a test driver's license." The name landed. Harper knew Harborline. Anyone in the business did. She also knew, vaguely, the story of a night gone bad, a crash in the rain, a driver who disappeared after the headlines faded. She kept her voice even. "Do you still hold that license?" "No," Jack said. "It expired after I walked away. I never renewed." Harper picked up her radio and called race control, then the small office where the track's legal rep had set up. She explained what she needed. A former licensed test driver, cleared for a one-off exhibition run, no championship points, under full supervision. She listened to a series of sighs and rustling papers on the other end. Then she reached for her cell phone. "Do you mind if I run your name?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "You're going to find it either way." She smiled a little at that and stepped to the window, turning slightly away as she dialed a number she knew by heart, a contact at the NCRA licensing office. She gave them his full name and waited, watching Timmy through the glass as he drew something and showed it to Rick. After a few minutes, her contact came back on the line. "Yeah," he said. "Jack Morgan. We remember him. One of Harborline's best test guys. Clean record until he vanished." He lowered his voice as if the story could leak through the phone. "He was involved in that Harborline crash years back. Lost his wife. The kid got hurt. He pulled his license, said he was done. We honored it." Harper thanked him and hung up. She came back to the table and sat down. "They confirmed it," she said. "You were a licensed test driver in the NCRA system. You left after the Harborline accident." Jack's eyes didn't flinch, but a muscle jumped in his cheek. "That's right," he said. "I'm not asking you to relive that," Harper said. "I'm asking something simpler. Race control says if we can verify your old license, get you through a quick medical check, and have you sign a waiver, they'll approve you for a short exhibition run. No points, no heroics, just a clean, controlled segment alongside Chase. Safety first." A knock sounded on the open door. The track's legal rep stepped in with a manila folder in hand. "This is the waiver," he said, sliding a few pages onto the table. "Exhibition driver waiver, non-competitive appearance. It states that you understand the risks of high-speed driving, that you're participating voluntarily, and that you accept personal responsibility for your own safety within the conditions we set. The track and the series are still on the hook for our side of the safety equation. We're not asking you to sign your life away, but we need this on paper." Jack skimmed the pages, lips moving a little as he read. He'd signed enough forms after Lily died to know what to look for. Clauses that shifted blame. Lines that erased people. This wasn't that. It was blunt and dry and, in its own way, honest. The legal rep went on. "Before you sign, you'll see the doctor," he said. "He'll check your vitals, ask about past injuries, and make sure you're fit for a short run. If he doesn't clear you, this doesn't happen." 10 minutes later, Jack sat on an exam table in the small medical room off the pit lane, while the track doctor listened to his heart and checked his reflexes. "Any dizziness? Blackouts?" the doctor asked. "No," Jack said. "Chest pain?" "Only when the bills come in," Jack answered, and the doctor huffed a small laugh. He moved Jack's arms and legs through a few ranges of motion, peered into his eyes, and finally stepped back. "You're cleared for a short exhibition," he said. "As long as you listen to instructions and remember this isn't a race for points." Back in the office, the legal rep pointed to the signature line. "If you're willing," he said. Jack thought of Timmy sitting outside with his sketchbook, of the letter on his fridge, of the promise he'd made to keep their life small and safe. Then he thought of the way his hands had remembered every inch of Lane's surface when he'd traced turn 3 in the dust. He picked up the pen. His name looked strange in ink next to the words driver appearance. It was the first time in years it had appeared on a racing document that wasn't tied to an accident report. As he set the pen down, footsteps sounded in the doorway. "So it's true," Chase said. He leaned against the frame, helmet bag in one hand, a smirk in place. The guard's real. His eyes flicked to the papers on the table. Careful, man. Once you start signing stuff, it's hard to pretend you're just the guy at the gate. Jack didn't rise to it. He just looked at him. Chase went on. Remember what I said in the garage? About kneeling? Looks like we might get our chance after all. Harper stood up before Jack could answer. This isn't about a bet, she said, her voice flat. This is about keeping a promise to a sponsor without putting anyone in a hospital. Jack is here because he knows how to keep a car under control. You're both here because I trust you not to make me regret this. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Chase shrugged and pushed off the doorframe. Whatever you say, boss, he said, and walked away. In the quiet that followed, Jack glanced down at the signature again. His own name stared back at him from the waiver, black ink on white paper, tying him back to a world he had sworn off. He didn't know yet if he had just made a mistake. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, the track wasn't just a place he guarded. It was a place that had his name on file again. By the time the sun started to slide down toward the tree line, Lane Speedway had changed. The easy shuffle of crew shoes on concrete had given way to the buzz of thousands of voices in the grandstands. The lights mounted high on the poles around the oval flickered on one by one, washing the track in a hard white glow that made every painted line and rubber streak stand out. Banners for Velocity Fuel glowed along the front stretch. On the big screen over turn 1, a hype video played on loop, showing cars in slow motion under sparks and smoke. From the infield, the crowd looked like a living wall, a blur of hats, t-shirts, and phone screens held up to catch everything. In the middle of it all, near Pit Road, 2 cars sat nose to nose under the lights. The number 7 car was slick and familiar, Chase Armstrong's name above the window, sponsors lined up on the quarter panels. Beside it, wearing a simpler scheme and the number 17, was the car Jack would drive. It was a backup chassis dressed up for the night, freshly decaled, no history on it yet. On the main PA, the announcer's voice rolled across the stands. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Velocity Duel presented by Velocity Fuel, he called. Tonight you'll see 2 Lane racing machines showcase just what this new blend can do under the lights. In the 7 car, you know him. You've seen him. Give it up for Chase Armstrong. The crowd roared on cue. The camera cut to Chase standing by his car, helmet under one arm, giving the practiced little wave that looked good on giant screens. And in the 17th, the announcer went on, leaning into the pause. A man who isn't a stranger to this track, even if you haven't heard his name. Former NCRA test driver, now part of our own security team here at Lane Speedway. For one night only, back behind the wheel, Jack Morgan. This time, the cheer was different. It was smaller at first, more curious than wild. But it grew as people processed what they'd just heard. Someone in the booth had chosen that phrase on purpose. Former test driver, now security. It sounded like the setup to a story, and crowds loved stories almost as much as they loved speed. Down on the ground, in a roped-off staff section near the pit wall, Timmy stood between a folding chair and the concrete barrier, a set of big earmuffs hanging around his neck. Beside him sat an interpreter from a local deaf services group, hired by the track for the night. She watched the big screen and the announcer's lips, then signed key phrases into Timmy's line of sight. When she signed his father's name, his eyes snapped up to the cars. Jack had traded his dark security jacket for a fire suit. It wasn't custom-made with his name stitched on the belt. It was a clean, generic lane suit pulled from storage, but it fit. The fabric felt weird under his fingers, too stiff in some places, and too familiar in others. In the little sponsor logo on his chest and the safety patches on his sleeves, he could see the ghost of the man he used to be. Harper stood beside him near the pit wall, a headset on, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Last chance to change your mind," she said quietly. Jack glanced toward the staff section. Timmy was pressed against the barrier, sketchbook forgotten at his feet, eyes locked onto the 17 car. His hands were already moving, fingers spelling out a clumsy version of his father's name to the interpreter, like he had to make sure the world knew who was in that suit. "Too late," Jack said. His voice was dry but steady. He didn't add that it had been too late the moment he picked up the pen and signed the waiver. A crew member handed him a helmet. He ran his thumb over a small scuff on the visor, then slid it on. The world narrowed to engine noise, the tight seal of the padding around his ears, and the thin rectangle of glass in front of his eyes. He climbed into the car in one easy motion, muscle memory taking over where thought used to be. The wheel clicked into place in his hands like it had been waiting for him. Over the radio, Harper's voice came through, steadier than she felt. "Remember," she said, "this is an exhibition. Clean in, clean out. You don't owe anyone a show." "Copy," Jack said. In the other car, Chase settled into his own seat, jaw set. He was used to the lights, the cameras, the way the crowd's roar vibrated through the chassis. He glanced over, expecting to see nerves in the way the other car rocked or rolled forward. Instead, he saw nothing but stillness. 17 sat on the line like it had grown there, waiting. On the broadcast, one of the commentators picked up the story the PA had started. "So this is interesting," he said. "Jack Morgan, former Harbor Line test guy. Dropped off the radar after that big rain crash a few years back. Now he's been working security here and somehow finds himself back in a fire suit." The other commentator answered, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "We've seen this go bad before. A good backstory doesn't always translate to a good run. The key tonight is going to be control. This isn't a full race, but the speeds and forces are still real." At pit road, a marshal stepped out front with a green flag rolled in his hand. "Engines!" Race control called over the radio. Jack hit the starter. The motor came alive under him, a deep vibration moving through the seat into his spine. For half a heartbeat, the sound tried to drag him back years, to the Harbor Line car, to rain on the windshield, to Lily's voice on a radio that went dead too early. He closed his eyes once behind the visor, opened them again, and focused on the here and now. Dry track, clear air, lights. A single, simple run. The marshal raised his arm. 3, 2, 1, Harper said quietly in his ear, even though the countdown belonged to the flag. The flag snapped down. Chase launched hard, tires barking, car surging ahead, a nose. Jack eased the clutch out and rolled into the throttle, smooth and measured. The 17 didn't leap. It unfolded, gathering speed in a straight, linear pull that felt more like a decision than a rush. By the time they hit turn 1, both cars were up to pace. Chase dove in aggressively, testing the grip high up near the wall. Jack took a lane lower, not blocking, not chasing, just feeling the surface under him, letting his hands and feet remember what readouts never could. From the stands, the difference was obvious. The 7 car snapped into the corner, bright and sharp, the kind of move that made for good replays. The 17 bent into it. No drama, no twitch, angle and speed perfectly matched. Nose pointed exactly where it needed to be. On the broadcast, the skeptical commentator adjusted his tone. "He's not here to play," he said. "Look at that entry. That's clean. No mid-corner correction, no wobble on exit." They ran side by side for a few laps, swapping the lead in a way that looked choreographed, but wasn't. Chase couldn't help himself. Every time he had half a car length, he tried to turn it into a statement, hanging the rear out just enough to get a cheer. Jack didn't bite. He left just enough room, kept his marks, and never let the car feel like it was being yanked around by ego. Each lap smoothed another wrinkle inside him. In the staff section, Timmy held onto the concrete barrier with both hands. He couldn't hear the commentary or the exact tone of the engines, but he felt the difference between how the two cars moved. One made the rail jump under his fingers. The other made it hum. After 6 laps, race control called for the cool-down. Chase crossed the line first by a car length and lifted, bringing the 7 car back toward pit road with a rev for the crowd. Jack rolled off almost in sync, slowing the 17 with the same quiet precision he'd used in every turn. He eased into his pit box without a squeal, without a skid, and brought the car to a stop so gently the water bottle on the dash barely trembled. The stands erupted in applause anyway. Some of it was for the idea of the duel, some of it for the winner in the 7 car. But a surprising amount of it swelled when Jack popped his belts and climbed out, helmet under his arm, hair damp with sweat, and eyes clear. On the big screen, a replay rolled of his line through turn 3, side by side with Chase's. The commentators talked through it, but the pictures said enough. No wasted movement, no panic, no drama, just control. Near the pit wall, Harper let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. On her headset, race control chimed in. Roll. 17's clean. That's one of the smoothest exhibition segments we've had in a while. In the staff section, Timmy jumped up and down, clapping, his hearing aids flashing under the lights. He didn't care who had crossed an invisible line first. He had just watched his dad drive a race car under stadium lights and bring it back in one piece. For him, that was the only scoreboard that mattered. The noise of the crowd still hung in the air when Jack stepped down from the side of the 17 car. For a second, his legs felt oddly light, like they hadn't gotten the message that the run was over. The fire suit was damp along his back, and when he pulled off his helmet, a line of cool air slid across his forehead. Harper was there first, hand on his arm, headset pushed back around her neck. "You did exactly what we needed," she said. "Clean, controlled, no drama, thank you." Jack nodded, still catching up to the idea that it was already past tense. "You're welcome," he said. It came out a little hoarse. Behind Harper, a couple of crew members from the 17 pit gave him small nods. Not the wild celebration they saved for trophies, but something quieter. Respect, edged with surprise. On the other side of pit road, Chase finished a quick on-camera interview. He said all the right things about velocity fuel and how great the car felt under the lights. He didn't look over at Jack once, but his jaw was tight in a way the cameras wouldn't catch. When the red light on the lens finally went dark, he walked away from the reporter and toward the lane hauler without acknowledging the 17. Near the staff section, Timmy pressed against the barrier as a marshal opened the gate long enough to let a few family members through. Rick lifted the rope and waved him forward. "Go on, kid," he said. "He's waiting." Timmy didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted the short distance to the pit lane, sketchbook bumping against his side. Jack saw him coming and dropped to one knee, arms open. Timmy barreled into him, nearly knocking him off balance. Jack laughed, the sound short and real. He leaned back enough to see his son's face, making sure they had eye contact. Timmy's hands moved fast, almost tripping over themselves. Fast. He signed. Good. You. Drive. He added a crooked little motion for the car, like he was still figuring out how to put the shape of what he'd just seen into his fingers. Jack swallowed. Yeah, he said quietly. I drove. He signed back, slowly. Safe. Promise. Timmy nodded hard, then pulled away just enough to dig into his backpack. He yanked out the notebook, flipped to a new page, and started drawing right there on pit road, crayons scratching over paper. In a few seconds, a rough outline of the track appeared, then 2 cars, one with a big number 7 over it, one with a 17. The 17 was just a little ahead. Jack watched him, a mix of pride and something heavier settling in his chest. Harper stepped up beside them, giving them a moment before she spoke. He did great, she said, nodding toward Timmy. So did his dad. Jack stood, resting a hand lightly on his son's shoulder. This was a one-time thing, he said, more to himself than to her. Harper looked out toward the front stretch, where workers were already resetting the pit lane for the main event. Maybe, she said. Maybe not. Velocity's people are asking who you are. They liked the story. A former test driver in a security jacket? That plays. Jack stiffened. I'm not looking for a comeback, he said. I did my job. I'm happy to put the jacket back on and go back to checking gates. Harper studied his face for a second. She saw the line there, drawn tight between duty and fear, between what he could do and what he believed he deserved. We'll talk later, she said. No one's making decisions tonight. In the lane hauler, the TV on the wall replayed the duel with the sound low. A clip of Jack's line through turn 3 rolled again. The commentators traced his arc with telestrator lines, talking about how calm the car looked. Chase stared at the screen, helmet bag still in his hand. One of the younger crew members let out a low whistle. "Man's smooth," he said. "Looks like the car's on rails." Rick shot him a look that said, "Don't be stupid." But the words were out. Chase didn't say anything at first. He watched the slow-motion replay of the 17 holding its line while his own 7 twitched a little at exit. A showman's flourish that looked less impressive when you could see the correction in high definition. "Yeah," he said finally. "Real smooth. For 6 laps." The edge in his voice made the room quiet. Someone muted the TV. Outside, the roar of the stands swelled as pre-race ceremonies started for the main event. Back on pit road, Harper walked with Jack and Timmy toward the tunnel that led under the track to the infield lot. The fire suit looked out of place now, like a costume left on after the play ended. At the entrance to the tunnel, she stopped. "You can keep that for tonight if you want," she said, nodding at the suit. "There's a locker you can change in before you leave, and the jacket will be waiting for you tomorrow." Jack managed a small smile. "Good to know I still have a job," he said. "You do," Harper answered. "What you did out there helps this place more than you realize. Velocity's happy, race control's happy, and that kid—" She glanced at Timmy. "He'll be telling this story for a long time." Timmy wasn't paying attention to them. He was looking back over his shoulder at the track, eyes wide, like he was trying to memorize the sight of it under lights. Later, at home, after the main race had come and gone and the traffic had thinned, Jack helped him out of his shoes at the apartment door. Timmy dropped his backpack, then ran to the little desk by the window and set his sketchbook down. He opened to the page he'd started at the track and added more color, filling in the 17 with a blocky version of the lane paint scheme. Jack leaned in the doorway, watching. "You liked it," he said. Timmy looked up, reading his lips. Then he made a sign Jack knew well by now, one they didn't use for food or school or routines. Happy. He touched his chest with an open hand and let it lift. You. Happy. Jack's throat tightened. He hadn't thought about his own face out there, about what it might have looked like from the stands or from behind the barrier. He'd only thought about the marks, the lines, the hum of the engine in his bones. "Maybe for a minute," he said. "Yeah." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk, careful not to bump the crayons. "But you know the deal, buddy," he added. "We keep it safe. No stupid risks. That's our rule." Timmy nodded and went back to his drawing, but there was a new steadiness in the way he filled in the lines, as something in him had settled. In the quiet that followed, the only sounds were the faint rush of cars on the highway outside and the scratch of crayon on paper. Back at the track, word about the security guard who'd gone toe-to-toe with a pro in an exhibition run moved through the paddock. Most people told it with a smile. A few added the extra detail, shared in low voices, about the way Chase had talked in the garage before any of this started, about the word kneel hanging in the air like a challenge no one with a kid wanted to hear. Chase heard those versions too, drifting back to him in fragments. The duel might have been scored as a win on paper, but the story that was starting to form around it didn't fit as neatly. By Monday morning, the track looked ordinary again. The grandstands were empty, the big screen over turn 1 was dark, and most of the banners for Velocity Night had already been taken down. Only a few zip ties and scraps of tape clung to the fences like leftovers from a party. Jack walked the inner corridor in his security jacket, radio back on his shoulder, steel-toed boots echoing on the concrete. If you didn't know what had happened under the lights, you'd think it had been just another race weekend. The people who worked there knew better. As he passed the main garage block, one of the younger mechanics from the 17 crew lifted a hand. "Hey, Morgan," he said. "Nice hands out there." It was a simple sentence, easy to miss. Jack nodded once. "Thanks." At the entrance to the tunnel, an older corner worker with a sunburned neck and a coffee in his hand tapped 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. "Good line through 3, he said. "Haven't seen anyone make it look that boring in a while." He grinned as he said it. For people like them, boring was a compliment. The quiet kind. In the main office area above Pit Road, Harper sat at a table with a laptop open and a stack of printouts beside her. On the screen, a paused video showed 2 cars under stadium lights, the 17 and the 7 running side by side through turn 3. A caption at the bottom read, "Security guard versus pro, you won't believe who's smoother." The video wasn't from the official broadcast. It was from someone in the stands who had filmed the duel on their phone, then chopped it into a 2-minute clip with dramatic text and a beat-heavy soundtrack. Overnight, it had been shared more times than anything Lane Speedway's official account had posted in months. Comments scrolled by in a flood whenever she hit play. People argued about line choice, about risk versus control, about what made a good driver. A surprising number of them had latched onto the same detail. The way the 17 car seemed to float through the corner like it was on rails. Her phone buzzed every few minutes with a new email. Most were from racing blogs and local news outlets asking for a quote. A few were from Velocity's marketing department. One of those emails was still open in front of her. It used phrases like authentic story and brand alignment, and real people doing extraordinary things. At the end, it made a clear request. They wanted a meeting about expanding the relationship with Jack Morgan. Harper rubbed her eyes and closed the laptop. She went to the window and looked down at the infield lot. Jack was walking along the fence line, checking a gate latch that stuck sometimes when the weather changed. He still moved as he had on Thursday, before any of this happened. Head down, shoulders steady, like the track owed him nothing. She keyed her radio. "Jack, can you swing by the operations office when you get a minute?" "Copy," his voice came back. A few minutes later, he stepped into the room, cap in hand. "You need something?" "Yeah," Harper said. "A conversation." She gestured to the chair. He sat. She turned the laptop back around and hit play. The video rolled, grainy but clear enough. They watched it without talking. They heard the crowd in the background, the commentators half buried under the phone's microphone, the small gasp from whoever was holding the camera when the 17 slid through turn 3 like it had been drawn there. When it ended, Harper let the silence sit. "That's going around," she said finally. "A lot." Jack stared at the frozen image on the screen. "I didn't ask anyone to film it," he said. "I know," Harper answered, "but it's out there anyway. Velocity saw it. They like what it does for their brand. They want to talk about a campaign, maybe a short series, Everyday Legends or something like that." She made a face at the name, but the idea was real. "They want you." Jack blinked. "Me?" he said. "As what?" "As yourself," Harper said. "A dad who works nights, keeps this place safe, used to be a test driver. They think people will connect with it. They're not talking about a full-time seat. They're talking about appearances, maybe some spots, maybe more exhibition stuff." He shook his head before she even finished. "I'm not putting my kid on a billboard," he said. "That's not what they asked for," she said. "They mentioned you, not him." "It won't stop there," Jack said quietly. "Once people know his face, they'll know his story. Kids at school, strangers online. I'm not handing that to them. He already lives with enough he didn't choose." Harper couldn't argue with that. She looked at him, seeing not just the calm driver from the night before, but the man who had spent 5 years building a small, careful life around a boy who heard the world differently. "Then we set boundaries," she said. "We say yes to what makes sense, and no to anything that doesn't. You don't have to decide today. I just need you to know this is on the table." He let out a breath. "I'll think about it," he said. "But right now, I'm just trying to make rent and keep him in that school." In another part of town, Chase sat at his kitchen counter with his own laptop open. The same video played on his screen. He'd watched it 3 times already. The first time, he'd told himself he was checking for angles, for anything that might make him look bad. The second time, he'd listened to the commentary, the way the skeptical tone had softened when they talked about the 17. The third time, he'd watched without sound. Without the noise, the difference between the 2 cars was stark. His 7 darted, corrected, performed. The 17 just moved. His phone buzzed with a message from his agent. "Have you seen the clip that's trending? We need to talk about the garage thing." He didn't answer right away. He scrolled down instead. Somewhere under the video, buried between praise and technical arguments, he saw a comment that made his stomach tighten. It was from a crew member whose username he recognized. It said, "Heard what he told the kid's dad in the garage before any of this. If you lose, you kneel. Not a good look." He closed the laptop harder than he meant to. The sound cracked through the empty kitchen. He rubbed a hand over his face. In the hauler, when they'd told the story, it had sounded almost funny. A stupid bit of trash talk, that had accidentally turned into a stunt. Online, with no control over how the words landed, it read differently. It reads mean. At school that afternoon, Timmy's teacher pulled Jack aside at pickup. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a stack of folders under one arm. "We saw the video," she said, smiling. "And the staff room's been passing it around all day. Timmy's very proud." Jack glanced down the hall where his son was zipping his backpack. "He liked it," Jack said. "Glad someone did." The teacher's smile softened. "We also got your email about the tuition letter," she said. "The administration is looking at scholarship options. It might take some time, but I want you to know we're trying." Jack nodded. Gratitude and worry sat side by side in his chest. On the drive home, Timmy pressed his palm to the window again when they passed the small race-themed billboard outside town. This time, instead of just a car, he traced an invisible number on the glass. 1. 7. Behind his hand, in the reflection, Jack watched his own face. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a tired man in a cheap car doing his best. Somewhere between the track, the school, and the bills on his counter, a story was forming around him, whether he wanted it or not. And hanging over all of it like a line painted in the wrong place was one sentence a driver had thrown out in a garage without thinking about who might carry it home. By Wednesday, the noise around the video had changed shape. The first wave of comments and shares had been pure excitement, people arguing about lines and courage and who they'd root for if the security guard ever ran a full race. Now Harper was getting emails with subject lines that used words like optics and narrative. Velocity still loved the clip, but their marketing calls sounded different. They asked for the full story, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned they had seen some chatter about something said in a garage before the duel. Harper knew exactly what they meant. A few threads had started repeating the same phrase the way gossip always did. "If you lose, you kneel." She decided she'd had enough of watching it from behind a screen. That afternoon, she left her laptop on the desk, grabbed her radio, and went looking for people instead of pixels. She found Jack in the lower concourse near the main gate, in his security jacket, logging a stubborn emergency exit door on his clipboard. Timmy sat on the floor nearby with his back against the wall, sketchbook open, drawing the 17 again, with stick figures in the stands and little rectangles that might have been phones held up toward the track. Harper waited until Jack finished with the latch, then told him she needed a few minutes in one of the small conference rooms off the hallway, the windowless kind they used for safety briefings and bad coffee. She'd already asked Rick to come up and sit with Timmy. When Jack glanced back down the hall, he saw the older crew chief arriving with a pair of sodas and a quiet joke that made the boy smile and go back to his drawing. In the conference room, Chase was already there, sitting on the edge of a chair with his hands clasped, looking like someone waiting to hear whether the damage was fixable. Harper closed the door and made it clear this wasn't a sponsor meeting, wasn't media training. She laid out the facts in plain language. The duel clip had gone wider than anyone expected. Velocity wanted to wrap a story around it, and the internet had already started attaching its own prequel, a sentence tossed in Garage 7 that landed a lot harder once people knew there had been a kid in the room. Then she stepped back and gave Chase the room. He didn't launch into a speech. He admitted slowly and without dressing it up that he'd thrown out the kneeling line because he'd wanted to feel bigger for a second, because it was easy to aim a joke downward and pretend that was strength. He said he hadn't thought about the kid at all until it was too late, and that he'd been watching that moment follow him around online in comments from people who would never hear the tone he'd meant it in, only the words he'd actually used. Jack listened, He'd heard a lot of apologies in the years since Harborline, some written by lawyers, some soft and polished for press conferences. This one was smaller than those, quieter, and for a moment, he weighed it the way he weighed everything now, against the picture of his son standing in that garage with his shoulders tense. When he finally answered, it was without raised voice or revenge in it. He made it clear he wasn't interested in seeing a grown man on his knees for the sake of some neat story. That humiliation wouldn't fix anything. The only thing that mattered to him was that Timmy had been treated like a prop, like a detail in someone else's swagger, and that the hurt had landed on a kid who hadn't chosen any of this. Harper backed him up. Before there could be talk of everyday heroes or campaigns, she said, they had to clean up their own mess in-house. No sponsor logos, no cameras, no carefully framed moments. If anything was going to be repaired, it would start in this bland little room with no one watching. When Jack finally spoke again, he didn't ask for a gesture that would play well online. He asked whether Chase was willing to say the same thing to Timmy's face, not as the pro from TV, but as the man who'd said something cruel and wanted to own it. Chase said he was. They went back out into the hallway. Rick had made good on his promise to stay close. Timmy sat on the floor by the soda machine, sketchbook on his knees, a crayon smudge on one thumb. When he saw the door open, his eyes went first to his father, then slid to the man behind him. The last time he'd seen that face up close, it had been framed by the harsh light of a garage and a word that made his stomach knot. Chase dropped into a crouch without being told, so that his eyes were below the boy's, not above. He didn't reach out. He made sure his mouth was easy to read and kept his sentences simple. He told Timmy his name and reminded him who he was in the most basic way. The fast driver from the other car. Then he said, just as plainly, that what he'd said in the garage had been wrong, that he'd talked about the boy like he was less because of his ears, and that it hadn't been about Timmy at all, only about his own need to feel big. He said the wrong person had paid for that moment. Jack stood close enough that Timmy could feel his presence. When his son looked up at him, searching for help, he didn't answer him. He signed slowly that the driver was saying he was sorry, and that what came next was up to Timmy. The boy put his drink down carefully and thought about it the way he thought about puzzles at school, forehead creased. Then he tapped his own chest, touched the small devices at his ears, and made the sign his teacher used when a classmate tried and got better. Good. He followed it with another, a simple down-cutting motion that meant stop. Good. And stop being mean. It wasn't flowery, but it didn't need to be. Chase nodded once, accepting the terms without turning them into a joke or a brand. Timmy picked up his sketchbook again and went back to his drawing. The conversation closed in the clean way. Kids sometimes managed when adults stayed out of their way. Some of the air in Harper's chest finally let go. This wasn't a viral moment. No one had documented it on a phone. No one had workshopped the phrasing. It was small and human and exactly the size it needed to be. Later, when Velocity circled back to ask again how much of Jack's story they could use, Harper would be clear. They could talk about the duel, the security jacket, the Harborline past, and the way control looked under lights. They could not touch the garage, or the sentence about kneeling, or the way a boy in a hallway decided to accept an apology on his own terms. That part belonged to the three of them and would stay off every storyboard. A week later, the clip had stopped exploding, but it hadn't gone away. It lived in that strange middle space where the internet half forgets and half remembers, turning up in group chats with a casual, "Remember this guy?" or buried in threads about control versus chaos on short ovals. Velocity's tone shifted with it. The exclamation marks in their emails turned into bullet points and attached PDFs. One morning, Harper sat in the operations office with one of those files open on her laptop. The title at the top read, in careful corporate font, Everyday Legends Proposal. Draft. It laid out a short-form series built around people like Jack. Workers in jackets instead of fire suits. 2 exhibition appearances per season. Behind-the-scenes segments about safety checks and late-night rounds. The phrases steady hands and quiet heroes kept popping up in the copy. At the bottom, there was a section highlighted in yellow about a community grant. She called Jack in between his rounds. He came up in uniform, cap in hand, looking more like the version of himself from before the duel than the man who'd stepped out of the 17 under stadium lights. She showed him the proposal, let him read without pushing. He took in the parts about appearances, about cameras, about him sometimes in a suit and sometimes in a jacket. His face barely moved, but his fingers tightened on the brim of his cap when he reached the section about the grant. Harper explained what Velocity was floating. Not a building with his name on it or a giant billboard, but money set aside for something local tied loosely to his story. Driver development, safety education, or a need-based scholarship at Timmy's school. The draft suggested the last option. She told him this had come from somewhere higher up in the chain, that someone in a room he'd never see had argued that if they were going to use a working dad in their story, they should put some of the budget where he lived. Jack wanted to know 2 things. He asked, in as few words as possible, what happened if he said no, and what happened if he said yes? Harper answered just as simply. No would mean he kept his job, kept his circuit of locks and latches, and let the clip sink into the background noise while Velocity found another angle. Yes would mean conditions, in writing. A hard limit on how often he got in a car. No cameras pointed at Timmy's face. No mention of the word kneel. No sad music about a broken hero. He would talk about safety and control and what it looked like to care about a track from both sides of the fence. If it ever stopped feeling honest, they would stop. The decision hung between them. Jack said he needed time and walked back out with the idea sitting heavy in his pocket alongside his keys and his radio. That afternoon, he sat in a cramped office at Timmy's school that smelled like dry erase markers and coffee. The principal had a folder open in front of her with his name on it. Timmy's teacher sat to the side, looking tired in the way teachers do in the 3rd quarter of a school year, but hopeful. They did not start with unfortunately. The principal explained that the school had been able to access a new community grant, funded in part by a partnership with Lane Speedway and Velocity. The money was earmarked for students whose families were caught in the gap between too much for full aid and not enough to absorb a tuition increase. Timmy's file fit the criteria. They could cover the extra amount and a little more. Jack would still carry his share, but the letter that had kept him up at night no longer meant a forced transfer to a cheaper school. The teacher added that Timmy had drawn the 17 on the board during free time that week and told his classmates, in simple sentences and signs, that his dad had driven a real race car. She said he had looked proud in a way she wished all her students could feel about something. On the drive home, the late light slanted across the windshield. In the rearview mirror, Jack could see Timmy tracing shapes into the fogged strip at the bottom of the window. An oval took form there, then 2 blocky cars, then a crooked number 17. At a red light, the boy caught his father's eyes in the mirror and held up 2 fingers in a quick, excited motion that needed no translation. Again. That night, when the dishes were stacked in the sink and the apartment had gone quiet, Jack knew he couldn't stall the conversation any longer. He sat on the couch beside Timmy, waited until the boy looked up from his sketchbook, and began to explain. He used short sentences and steady lips, the way the speech therapist had taught him. People at the track wanted him to drive a little more, he said. Not full races for trophies, but short, controlled runs like the duel. They wanted to point cameras at him sometimes and ask him to talk about what it meant to keep a place like that safe. There was money attached. Some of it would go directly to them, enough to help with tuition and bills. Some of it would go to the school, in the form of the scholarship the principal had described. Then he laid out the line he wasn't willing to cross. No one would point a camera at Timmy without permission. No one would use his hearing aids or his silence as a prop. If at any point the boy felt exposed or made fun of, Jack would walk away. He made sure to sign that part as clearly as he could. Safe first. Timmy thought about it longer than he usually thought about bedtime or dessert. He set the sketchbook down, wrapped his arms around himself for a second the way he did when he was lining up his thoughts, then answered in the simple grammar their hands shared. He signed that he wanted his dad to be happy and safe, that he liked watching him drive, and that he didn't need to be on any screen to feel part of it. He drew a small circle in the air with one finger and tapped it twice, their shorthand for together. Jack felt something shift inside him at that. The conversation turned, as it always did when they brushed up against the track, toward Lily. He realized there were parts of the story his son only knew in pieces, so he filled in more of it. Not the horror movie details, just the truth stripped down. It had been raining. He had been doing his job. Another car had done something it shouldn't have, and in the chaos that followed, a chain of bad luck and bad timing had landed on the wrong people. He told Timmy he had spent years believing that if he had been better, faster, sharper, none of it would have happened. That staying out of a cockpit was his punishment and his promise. Saying it out loud, he heard how it sounded. Timmy listened, fingers resting on the scar near his ear where the first surgeries had been, then used a sign they had learned in counseling sessions when the air got heavy. Remember. He tapped his chest, then his father's, then his sketchbook, and finally the space above them, marking the places where his mother still existed. It wasn't a solution. It was a map. Jack followed it as best he could. He told his son that if he said yes to velocity, it wouldn't be because he loved speed more than the boy sitting next to him. It would be because maybe there was a way to turn what had already gone wrong into something that made the track safer for the next family, who had no idea what could happen on a wet night. Maybe another kid with ears like Timmy's would get to sit in a quieter hospital someday, because somebody took the time to talk about control instead of just glory. Timmy nodded hard at that, a small, fierce motion, and picked up his pencil. In the empty infield of his latest drawing, he added 2 stick figures near the number 17 car, one tall, one small, both facing the same direction. When he went to bed, Jack stayed up a little longer than usual. He laid out his clothes for the next day on the chair by the door, the habit he never shook from his years of early shifts. This time, he didn't just fold the security jacket over the back. He hung the fire suit beside it, shoulders touching. The sight of them next to each other looked wrong and right at the same time, like 2 halves of a life he hadn't believed could coexist. He turned off the main light and stepped toward his room, not seeing the small shadow slip out of the doorway down the hall. Timmy padded over in socked feet, carefully adjusted the jacket and the suit so they leaned into each other instead of away, then took the drawing with the 2 figures and the 17 and laid it across the seat like a bridge. In the morning, when Jack reached for his clothes, he stopped. For the first time since the crash, he could imagine walking into Lane Speedway carrying both sides of himself at once. The man with a radio and a checklist, and the man who knew what a car felt like at the edge of its grip. Between them, on a sheet of paper covered in pencil lines and crayon, his son had sketched a third role he hadn't had a name for yet. A father trying to stand in that middle space and bend it, even a little, toward a safer world. By the time spring rolled around, the clip of the duel had become part of the background noise of the sport. It still surfaced now and then in compilation videos about underrated moments, or in arguments about who really understood car control, but it no longer felt like a live wire. What had stayed, quietly, were the things built around it. On a clear Saturday evening, Lane Speedway hummed with the slow build of a race night. The sun was low enough to throw long shadows across the infield. Banners for Velocity Night 2.0 hung on the fences, the copy a little more subdued than last year. There was a new sign near the main entrance that hadn't been there before, a simple metal plaque bolted to the brick. Community Safety Grant Partner, Lane Speedway, Velocity. Most people walked past it on their way to the ticket line without slowing down. A few parents stopped long enough to read the smaller print about scholarships and hearing-friendly viewing areas. In a room under the grandstands, away from the engine noise, a small group of kids and parents sat on folding chairs. 2 rows of posters lined one wall with diagrams of harnesses, fire systems, and flag colors. Jack stood at the front in a polo shirt with the track logo on it. Not a fire suit. One hand resting on the back of a plastic chair. He'd spent the last 20 minutes explaining what safety crew actually meant, how many people worked a corner, and why yellow flags flew. He didn't mention Harbor Line by name. He talked instead about bad nights becoming better systems if people were honest about them. At the back of the room, Timmy sat in the end chair, his sketchbook on his lap, hearing aids linked to a small transmitter on the desk, so his father's voice cut through the muffled noise outside. Every so often, his hand moved, adding another line to the car he was drawing. When the session ended, there was no standing ovation. Just a few parents coming up to ask quiet questions, kids tracing the outlines of roll cages on the posters with their fingers. One mother with a little girl wearing bright pink ear defenders thanked Jack without making a big speech about it. Just a nod that carried its own weight. Above them, in the main bowl, the crowd started to settle in. On the big screen over turn 1, a new piece of content rolled just before driver introductions. It was 2 minutes long, cut from footage that had taken weeks to gather. There were no slow-motion crashes, no heroic music. It opened with a shot of Boots walking through a dark, empty grandstand, a flashlight beam checking rows. It cut to gloved hands tugging on a harness in tech, to a corner worker stepping back as a car slid safely past a barrier, to Jack in his jacket, writing a sticky latch number on a clipboard. Only halfway through did it show the duel, the 17 sliding through turn 3 under lights. A few shots from that night, Timmy at the barrier with his sketchbook, Harper on the pit wall, Rick watching from behind his headset, flickered by in quick cuts. A simple line of text ran along the bottom. Some nights are won by who gets home quietly. There was a voiceover near the end, just a few sentences from Jack, recorded in the operations office on a Tuesday, with no one but Harper and a sound tech listening. He talked about what it meant to be the person checking gates when everyone else had gone home, about how the loudest moments at a track weren't always the most important ones. He said, in plain words, that the way people talked around kids stayed longer than any checkered flag. When the piece faded out, and the screen went black for a beat before the next sponsor rotation, there was a brief, odd hush in the stands. It wasn't the roar that followed a photo finish or a big wreck. It was a pause, like a collective breath held for half a second, while people reset the way they ranked what mattered. Then the announcer's voice kicked back on, the band in the infield cranked up, and the usual noise returned. In the infield, Chase watched the end of the video from beside his car. No cameras were on him. The Everyday Legends spot wasn't about him. He was just another driver waiting for introductions. When Jack's voice mentioned the way words landed around a kid, he felt his throat tighten for a moment. He didn't look around to see who else might be thinking about Garage 7. He already knew what he needed to carry from it, and what he needed to leave alone. A few months earlier, he had found himself in the middle of a conversation with younger drivers in a haulier, the kind of banter that used to come easily. Someone had been about to make a joke at a crew member's expense, something about a limp and what's wrong with him. Chase had heard the setup, and without making a speech, steered it sideways. He'd said it wasn't smart to drag families or bodies into trash talk, that there was enough in the stopwatch to argue about. The change was small, barely noticeable from the outside. But in a world built on repetition, small corrections added up. On the family side of the grandstands, in a section the track now lists on its map as Quiet View, Timmy sat between Harper and Rick with a program in his hands. There were extra speakers in the section, tuned to a clearer range for assistive devices, and a row of signs explaining flags in simple icons. The scholarship paperwork for next year sat at home on Jack's table, already signed. When the Everyday Legends clip played, Timmy watched his father move across the screen in that strange third-person way the video was created, jacket and all. His own face did not appear. His sketchbook did, once, in a quick shot of small hands over a drawing, but only from the side. The people who didn't know him would never connect it. He knew. That was enough. Later that night, after the main event had run and the winner had done the usual smoky burnout on the front stretch, the lights stayed on a little longer than usual. An exhibition run had been listed on the schedule in small print, tucked between fireworks and "Thank you for coming." The 17 rolled off pit road under a fresh coat of Velocity branding that didn't lean too hard into heroics. Jack climbed in with the same careful motions he'd used on duel night, suited and belted with the same attention to detail he used when checking a gate lock. Up in race control, the officials treated the run like any other car on track. Radio checks, safety confirmations, a green flag that counted even if no points were at stake. The laps themselves were not dramatic. There were no near misses, no last-second saves. The car moved through the corners in the same steady arc it had traced months before, the kind that made spotters relax and engineers nod. In the Quiet View section, Timmy leaned forward, hands wrapped around the rail, feeling the vibration come up through the metal more than he heard the engine itself. His fingers moved in a small pattern at his chest as the car went by, a private sign he'd started using that didn't have a perfect English match. It was somewhere between proud and okay. When the run ended, Jack brought the car down off the banking and into the infield, with the kind of calm that made the whole thing look uneventful. That was the point. He parked where he'd been told, killed the engine, and sat for a second in the quiet that rushed in when the noise stopped. Then he climbed out, accepted a nod from the Velocity rep who had come down for the photo he'd agreed to, and walked back toward the tunnel with his helmet under one arm. At the other end of the tunnel, hanging on a hook in the hallway, his security jacket waited. He slipped it on over the base layer of his suit without thinking about the mismatch. It fit. On his way out to make one last round of the emptying stands, He met Timmy at the base of the steps. The boy held up the program, now creased and marked with lines where a small hand had traced the path of the 17 around the printed track map. Jack didn't need him to sign anything to understand what he was saying. The track, for tonight, had been loud and safe. On the drive home, the billboard outside town that once showed a generic car now carried a new image. It wasn't Jack's face or Timmy's. It was a night shot of Lane Speedway under lights with a small line of text along the bottom. Get home quiet. Drive with respect. Most people passing at highway speed only caught the logo in the corner. A few read the rest. Down the road in a 2-bedroom apartment, a fire suit and a jacket hung side by side on the back of a chair, shoulders touching. On the table lay a sketchbook open to a page with an oval, a car marked 17, and 3 small figures near the inside wall. 2 were holding hands. The third stood a little ahead, one arm lifted as if signaling a green flag no one could see. On a mild Saturday, a year after the duel, the noise around Lane Speedway sounded different in one small corner of town. It wasn't the full-throated roar of late models or the layered hum of a big race night. It was smaller, higher-pitched, and full of stuttered throttle as kids in helmets learned what a cart felt like when it moved under them instead of just on a screen. The community kart track sat a few miles away from the main oval, tucked behind a line of trees and a grocery store. For years, it had been a half-forgotten practice pad, mostly used by a handful of diehards and one local driving school. The surface was still cracked in places, patched with fresh asphalt where the worst spots had been cut out. Now there were banners on the fence with logos for Lane Speedway and Velocity, and a laminated sign on the gate that mentioned youth safety clinics and scholarship sessions. The grant money that had started as a line item in a PDF had turned into cones and instructors, and a stack of loaner helmets lined up on a folding table. Jack stood near the grid in a plain T-shirt with the track logo on the chest, and a lanyard that called him Instructor in block letters. He had spent the morning walking kids through basic rules: how to sit, how to wear a helmet so it didn't tilt, what the flags meant, even on something this small. He moved the same way he did on race nights, checking buckles twice, tapping a wheel here and there to make sure lug nuts were snug. The Harborline story sat in his chest, like an old scar, present but not exposed. He talked instead about what it meant for a kid to go home with a scraped knee instead of a hospital bracelet. On the other side of the fence, Timmy stood with a clipboard of his own. He had insisted on one when he saw the instructors carrying them. His hearing aids were linked to a portable transmitter again, catching his father's voice when he stepped close enough, blending it with the higher chatter of excited kids. Every so often, he looked down to make notes in a crooked mix of block letters and little sketches, corners that looked like squares, arrows showing where someone had turned in too early. Among the group of kids waiting for their turn was a boy about Timmy's age with a band of dark hair sticking out from under a borrowed helmet. A thin line ran from behind one ear down to a small processor clipped to his shirt. When one of the instructors gave a set of verbal instructions about breaking points, the boy's eyes drifted, not out of boredom, but because the sound blurred. Timmy noticed. He stepped closer, caught the boy's eye, and lifted his hands. The signs they shared were messy and half-learned, pulled from school and counseling sessions and their own improvisations. They were enough. He pointed at the first cone, then at the boy's chest, and made the small twisting motion that meant slow, then the firmer push that meant stop. The boy's shoulders relaxed. He nodded. On the grid, Jack saw the exchange and made a mental note without interrupting it. The program had been billed as open to all, no experience needed, no perfect bodies or ears required. It was another promise he had taken seriously. Some of the parents watched from folding chairs along the straight, coffee in hand, sunglasses on. A few had seen the dual clip months ago and recognized the man moving up and down the line. Most only knew him as the one who had checked their child's helmet twice and made sure the chin strap was snug enough that the kid could not shake it off. One mother with a race t-shirt, a size too big for her frame, glanced between the banner about safety and the cart where her daughter sat, fingers tight on the tiny steering wheel. She caught Jack's eye for a second and gave a small nod. There were no speeches. The first session went out in a staggered release, one cart at a time. The track was short and tight, more about placement than speed. The kids wobbled on entry, chopped at the throttle, braked too much, and then not enough. They learned. A few spun harmlessly in wide arcs that kicked up dust and embarrassed giggles. In the quiet between sessions, while the next group lined up, one of the other instructors made a remark under his breath about a kid who had been timid, something about being too scared for this, and maybe better off just watching from the stands. It was not cruel, just careless in the way people sometimes were when they forgot who might hear. Chase had dropped by the clinic that morning on his way to the main track, a baseball cap pulled low and no sponsors on his shirt. He stood near enough to hear the throwaway line. He didn't make a scene. He simply shifted closer and nudged the comment sideways, the way he had taught himself to do in the months since the garage. He reminded the instructor, in a quiet voice, that nobody got brave without being scared first, and that starting from the stands was exactly how most of them had ended up here. The point landed without drama. The instructor nodded and moved on. The correction was small, another degree of adjustment in a world that lived on them. When the last session of the day wrapped, the sun had started to tilt down and the air had taken on that golden edge that made everything look softer. The kids peeled off helmets with sweaty hair and red cheeks. Parents gathered up water bottles and stray gloves. Someone brought out a box of simple participation certificates. There were no trophies. Each paper had the same text, printed in black. Today you learned how to drive with respect. Jack handed them out one by one, bending slightly to meet each pair of eyes. When it was the boy with the processor, he didn't linger on the device. He just made sure the boy saw his mouth shape the words as he said his name, and rested his hand for a second on the edge of the certificate so they both held it. Off to the side, Timmy flipped his own clipboard closed. He had drawn a small version of the kart track in the margin, an oval inside an oval, with dots where he thought more cones should go next time. Later, in the car, he would tap that sketch and sign to his father that they needed another clinic soon. On the drive home, they passed the big billboard near the edge of town. The message from race night was still there. Get home quiet. Drive with respect. The image behind it had been updated for spring, less dramatic now. Just a shot of the track at dusk with a safety truck parked near turn 4 and a handful of workers in vests walking the wall. In the passenger seat, Timmy traced the outline of the letters on the glass without needing to see everyone. At home, the fire suit and the security jacket still hung side by side on the back of the same chair. On the table nearby, Timmy left his clipboard next to Jack's, paper edges overlapping. One had notes about gate latches and maintenance schedules. The other had a cartoon oval and a cluster of cones drawn in different colors. They did not look like much from a distance. Up close, they were the record of a man and his son learning, in slow, steady turns, how to use what had once hurt them to make a narrow strip of world a little safer.